With that, I'd like to welcome Ann Clothier.
Thank you very much. Oh, and I think I'll grab the mouse so that's the other thing. Okay, excellent. All right, have to get the technology arranged. So, all right, good evening. Very happy to be here this evening, and this is a topic that, as I tend to joke around and say that I come by quite naturally. I have a long family history with this topic. Let's see, how many generations going back? And you'll probably notice I'll probably be making eye contact and in jokes with someone in the audience too. My mother is here. I can actually blame her for a lot of this. And in fact, a lot of the collection over on that table, a lot of that actually belongs to her as well. And so she's a local historian up in Corinth, and also the granddaughter of grave diggers. She's dug a few graves herself, as have my uncle and my father. Talk about a hazing experience for a son-in-law. So my family has been involved with cemeteries, again, for quite a while. My great-grandfather was a cemetery superintendent over in Malta Ridge, and cared for a cemetery or two over there. And so, again, digging graves, caring for the cemetery, making sure things are mowed and maintained. So there's always been, again, this undercurrent of cemeteries and funeral practices and all of those things in the family. I'm trying to remember when I was taken to my first funeral or calling hours. It might have been 4 or 5 years old. Three, okay. So death is something that has never really been shied away from in my family. And I want to give a bit of a disclaimer this evening as well, in that I tend to sometimes have a dark sense of humor, and apologies for that, but I do lighten some topics occasionally, so bear that in mind. I mean no offense to anyone, and even my apparel this evening is a nod to that as well. So, but this is, again, a topic that is also very important, both historically. Death was a major part of life historically, and that all families had to deal with in one form or another, even more so than we do today. Before the advent of modern medicine and antibiotics and modern techniques, the simplest things could be fatal. In fact, last night in my house, apparently at some point in time, piece of a glass had been dropped, and I stepped on a piece of glass last night that went pretty deep into my foot, and got it out, and all like that, and got some antibacterial ointment on there and everything. But again, just that knowledge that 150 years ago, with infection, something as simple as that could actually be fatal to someone. And I've read of stories of women pricking their fingers badly with a needle while sewing and eventually dying from an infection of that. Was it common? Not necessarily, but again, you see references to this in journals, in early newspapers. Again, how fleeting life could be and how random death could be, and from the most seemingly minor things. So the first part I'm going to be talking about tonight is actually on the topics of some common diseases. And so I'll go through some of those, and then we'll talk a little bit about some treatments, what worked, what didn't, and some descriptions and newspaper articles, and then we'll transition into what happened when the treatments did not work, and talk a bit about, again, funeral practices and graveyards and things like that. Now, I always forget this part, and I have to be good. I'm also here this evening again from Brookside Museum, which is the home of the Saratoga County Historical Society. And on the right-hand side of the table over there, I've included, there's pamphlets and brochures and things like that. We do have an event coming up this summer, in case anyone has any teen or tween, grandchildren, children, neighbors, nieces, nephews, that sort of thing. We're doing an archaeology camp in late July, early August that is a true archaeology dig, and that is run by a real archaeologist, and it's on the site of Brookside, which is a 1792 hotel. And I've had parents who have sent their kids to this camp, and I had someone say one time, "You bury the most amazing things for these kids to find." I don't put that much work into the camp. What they are finding are actually artifacts, things that have not seen the light of day in 150, 200 years. So these students, these campers, are actually, again, taking part in a real archaeology dig, the metric measurement, the mapping, the digging, the finding, the analyzing of the artifacts, the cleaning of them, and they also present at the end about their findings. So I have fulfilled my obligation. I have talked about and marketed the museum. So I actually managed to do that. Again, anyone interested in anything, materials are over there, just let me know. And also, speaking of, again, the rest of the table, as I said, a lot of it's my mother's collection. There's a lot of items that have been found at yard sales, estate sales, antique shows, our own attic, things like that. So feel free to take a look through and enjoy browsing over there afterwards as well. Now, I also, another disclaimer of sorts, is that I find this topic interesting, but I do not consider myself an expert yet. There is so much that can be learned on this. In addition, there's, I don't know, dozens of topics inside of this lecture itself that could become hour-long lectures themselves. So apologies if there's something that you're really interested in and want to hear more about, and I've only given it one slide or brushed past it a bit. I'm happy to chat with anyone afterwards and discuss more, and my business cards are over there with my email address. But again, I'm still learning about some of these things, and so if anyone has additional information, if anyone has family stories that you'd like to share, and anything like that that you'd like to include, just let me know, and we will add it to the presentation, and we'll chat a little bit here as well, and there'll be time for question and answer at the end too. Now, again, looking at mortality in history, it's something that we think of today. It might be foreign to a lot of people if you haven't dealt with too much death in your life. It could be something you're intimately acquainted with if you have lost family members or close friends. But the modern sort of social atmosphere is that death is something that you keep over there. You are trying to keep a distance from it. Think of funeral parlors, funeral homes, and undertakers and things like that. There's originally, as we'll talk about in a little while, the funerals were happening in the home. Today, for the most part, people are doing funerals at the funeral parlor and in town. And so that's been a major change that has happened. Let's see, there we go. Now again, in talking about illness and things that could eventually lead to death, it's worth noting that where we are located is historically a place that has actually attracted people who are suffering from illness. Both here in Saratoga Springs and also in Ballston Spa. The mineral springs have been attracting people here for centuries to attempt to use the healing powers of the mineral water. And in fact, even before, sometimes you'll see signs on the springs that say discovered in 1771, discovered in 1774, things like that. I always encourage people to either take that with a grain of salt or do a bit more research, because in some of these cases, some of the springs were known about long before that. just not necessarily by people from Europe. Native American people, the Iroquois, Abenaki, a lot of native peoples have been using mineral water for healing properties for hundreds and hundreds of years before anyone from Europe happened to set foot around. And in fact, it was Iroquois allies that brought Sir William Johnson here to Saratoga Springs, I believe in 1771, because he was suffering from a variety of complaints, some from old war wounds and also a lot of gout he was dealing with as well. So again, these springs have brought people here for a long time, and you see references about Saratoga Springs and Ballston Spa being of interest to invalids. And of course, the famous sign, health, history, and horses. And someone in particular that came to Ballston Spa with efforts to heal herself was a young woman named Abigail May, and she traveled from Boston to Ballston in the summer of 1800. And there's actually a documentary that's been done that's available on YouTube if anyone is interested, that goes through her experiences. She wrote a series of letters to her sister back in Boston that act as a journal. And she talks about her treatments and how some doctors were encouraging her to drink huge quantities of the mineral water. Others were encouraging her to bathe in it, wrap bandages that had been soaked in mineral water around her affected arm. So she talks a lot about that. And again, that documentary is a good chance to learn some more about that. And if you just search from Boston to Ballston, that should come right up. Using sort of retrospective diagnosis, what we've sort of come to the conclusion of was that Abigail May was dealing with some sort of neurological disorder and possibly multiple sclerosis even. And unfortunately, after she had spent a few months here, she traveled home to Boston and she died about a month later. So again, we don't know for sure exactly what was happening, but the other thing was that her travel, even today, thinking, oh, I'm going to take off for Boston tomorrow. It's a long trip even today, but in an era of horse and stagecoach, that was quite an undertaking, especially if one was having health challenges. And staying in taverns and stagecoach stops and inns and things like that. You never know what illnesses may come into contact with as well. Now this was one that Abigail May actually mentions, concerns about being coming into contact with smallpox, and this was certainly one of, if not the most feared illness in the 18th century and into the 19th century. And one thing we don't think about very much today is the effect that it had not only in terms of mortality, how many people it killed, but also on the survivors. And if in reading advertisements for runaway indentured servants and escaped enslaved people, there's a lot of talk in descriptions, physical descriptions of people being pockmarked and showing that they were survivors of smallpox, and that it really could disfigure a person's face permanently. There were certainly other diseases that could have eruptions, skin eruptions, and this is a French engraving from 1880 that actually compares three similar-looking diseases. Now, smallpox was also a major concern among the indigenous peoples, among the Native Americans, with no natural immunity, and also the fact that it was sometimes being used as biological warfare through blankets and other textiles that were given as gifts or traded with the Native American people, that this was a disease that absolutely ravaged Native American populations. Now, these are some part of a story from the Saratoga Sentinel and also the Saratogian as well. And we see here that the smallpox was actually, again, major news in the newspaper. And so this one actually from Milford in Otsego County, and again, this was reported on up here in Saratoga. A man of the name of Chidester has sickened, and his disease was pronounced by his attending physician to be a liver complaint from his having been sometime afflicted with that disorder. He died, and his funeral was numerously attended. Several persons shortly after sickened with symptoms similar to those which attended the case of Chidester, and it was some days before it was ascertained that their disease was smallpox. 1 or 2 deaths ensued, but efficient measures have since been taken to prevent its extension. And also, we have here mention of the Board of Health being established, and a major part of that was dealing with smallpox. All physicians having any cases of smallpox or cholera shall immediately report such cases to the health officer or to one of the Board of Health. So, again, this was a major concern. Yes?
Are they saying that people who came to see him dead got smallpox?
Yes.
And that means they're touching him, or he's not coughing on them?
So there could have been, again, some contact with the coffin or some of the textiles. Smallpox is something that actually can easily be passed through textiles and things like that. So even if the individual is laid out coffin and someone puts their hand on the coffin or things like that, there could be concern about that. In fact, going back to the family history, back when the Sacandaga Reservoir was being built, my great-grandfather, Simeon Morehouse, again, someone who had dug plenty of graves, was approached to actually go up to Sacandaga, or what became Sacandaga Reservoir, and to go to some of the towns that were going to be evacuated and no longer exist, and to exhume bodies and move cemeteries. And the money was going to be excellent. It was very tempting, but my great-grandmother Emma found out that he would have to go into quarantine for some time. And she said, no way, no how. But there was sufficient concern that smallpox could be reestablished by the opening of graves. So that's why they were going to put the diggers into quarantine for a time after they were finished with that project. Yes?
Are you taking questions now?
Sure.
Okay. Going back to the slide about the Native Americans,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little surprising that to me, that you talked about biological warfare. Were the white population that aware that they could put smallpox in blankets and give them to the Indians and they would die?
Yes. There's another sort of tangent that we could go off on, certainly, was that there was such fear of smallpox that in some cases, after certain diseases went through a family, we've seen both archaeologically and also through oral history evidence that people would come in and just burn down the house if a whole family had died of a certain disease. And that includes very high-end items that were just left in a structure and burned to the ground. That is how much concern there was anything being taken out of the house. A piece of porcelain, a watch even, who knows, that it was just burned because there was such concern about contagion being passed. But French and Indian War, I believe it was used, and a lot of other wars and conflicts in America's history, and quite likely before as well, where it was used in that way. They didn't know exactly how it spread. Germ theory was still in development later on, and things like that, but they knew that there was danger in touching something that someone with that disease had previously touched. So, yep. Now, as in the last slide, where there was an issue of misdiagnosis There was a major case that Saratoga Springs saw in the mid-1870s that about Dr. T.E. Allen here in Saratoga Springs, who had a medical institute here, and so there was concern, and this gets into it a little bit more thoroughly here. In the latter part of the month of November, 1875, the child of Mrs. Carrie Chase, residing on Washington Street in a thickly settled part of the village, became sick with an eruptive disease. Dr. Thomas Allen, a physician practicing in the village, was called. The child died, and several matrons in the vicinity went in to perform the last offices, wash the corpse, prepare it for burial. About a night later, they were taken with a similar disease. Other physicians were called, and it was pronounced the smallpox, or in some instances, the varioloid. A strict quarantine was at once established, and Dr. Allen was severely censured by the public for not reporting the case of the Chase child. He replied that it did not have the smallpox, but what we would know today as chickenpox. Several deaths followed from the foul disease, but the excitement had about, this goes on to another part of that, but the thing is about Dr. Allen, running off is not a new concept among those who are under suspicion. Allen's indictments were then sent to the next sessions for trial, but previous to that he had sought safety in a permanent journey to some terra incognita, having probably gone to be a companion of the forger Winslow under the protecting aegis of the British flag. So he skipped town, he skipped country. So I don't know, I haven't been able to find out exactly how or even if this was ever resolved. But this was a story that was actually in the Bench and Bar of Saratoga County, or Reminiscences of the Judiciary, that was also published in the 1870s, and an excellent source for finding out some, in some cases, interesting stories about local history. So this year we're hearing a lot about influenza and its history because it is the centennial of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And sometimes that leads to feeling that it was a new disease in 1918. In fact, it was just a really, really bad year of influenza that year. And this is actually a very early New York Gazette, and this one, and I'm seeing if I managed to catch the date on there, might not have quite made it in there, but this is early 18th century, and a disorder similar to that now prevalent in London, influenza, has made incidence in this city and neighborhood. The number of people affected with it has ever been but small, and the symptoms no way alarming. So influenza was a term that was first used by Italy, and the term caught on. And again, 1918 is when that really became a worldwide topic. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Spanish influenza, and that's very unfortunate because it's propaganda in a way, because Spain was attempting to remain neutral in World War I, and so it was a way of sort of blaming Spain, when in fact they're starting to find that it looks like it came from Kentucky at a military camp, and where the symptoms started appearing. So people are still researching this and looking into this, but yeah, the United States is looking like what actually where it originated. So, and we have here from the Saratogian a reference to no abatement of disease rooted in two towns, and Bert Allen a victim, funeral for Philo Smead held yesterday, and talking about Hadley, Luzerne. So this was a major, again, topic of conversation, topic of newspaper articles. And there it is, that Spanish influenza reference, but they're also encouraging, don't spit. Spitting spreads Spanish influenza. Now, also, the extreme importance of high school sports is nothing new. And if we look in newspapers, and I had the date notes here, but they're talking about Schenectady Hospital, accommodations insufficient, supply of nurses inadequate, theaters closed in Troy, schools shut down in Albany, high school to continue football. Priorities, man. Now, consumption, something you hear a lot about, and that is tuberculosis, as is what we know it more as today. And again, typically a lung disease, but tuberculosis also could affect other organs and other bodies. Again, primarily associated with the lungs. And this also gives us a good idea of how common consumption was as a cause of death. And here from an 1801 newspaper from Otsego County, by report of the clerk of common council of the city, it appears that the whole number of deaths from the 7th to the 14th instant inclusive was 31, of whom 12 were adults and 19 children. Another reminder that, again, it was a dangerous time to be a child, and while the immune system was still developing, all of these different diseases could certainly wreak havoc, even within single families. And let's see, that 2 died of a slow fever, 1 of a hectic fever, 1 of chin cough, whooping cough, and 2 of old age, 2 of casualties, some form of accidents, 4 of smallpox, 1 of hives, that one's interesting, and that could be some sort of severe allergic reaction, or it could be a misdiagnosis of some other disease. 2 of sprue. Now that's one I forgot to look into. Anyone have any remembrance of that? 1 of lockjaw, 2 of fits, 1 in childbed, 6 of consumption, and 1 of palsy, and 5 of diseases not mentioned. So of all of these, it was actually consumption that took the most people. And it could be a very long-term disease as well. And with people lingering and suffering, again, typically with this lung disease for quite a long time. Saratoga County had its own location for people who were suffering from tuberculosis, and the homestead over around the town of Providence was opened as a location for people with tuberculosis. It still stands today, parts of it, and it is unfortunately quite an attractant to adventure seekers. And there's actually been a very, very low-budget Blair Witch style horror movie that was filmed in illegally, trespassing. But again, it does still stand, but they do have extensive problems with trespassing and vagrancy and all sorts of problems over there.
That's the Christian?
Yes, yep. And much like that sign that we saw about the influenza and don't spit, well, there were also public health campaigns to try and prevent people from expressing sputum, as clinically call it, and spittoons, and so a sputum bottle became common in saloons and things like that in an attempt to try and at least condense and contain fluids. And actually, there's an image here of a hotel, I believe right here in Saratoga Springs, and if you look very carefully under that chair to the left-hand side, there is a spittoon right there waiting. And you will see it in early documents referred to in different ways, even in the same writing, same script. One is a reference to tuberculosis, one is a reference to consumption. It could be different reporting doctors. It could be they're referring to consumption as the lung disease, tuberculosis as a different organ system. It's not quite clear, but again, even within the same document, you will see differences in how it's referred to. Another disease you see commonly is diphtheria. And the diphtheria epidemic has subsided here, and the schools will open again on Monday. The dreaded disease is now making havoc out near DeRayster and Oneida. In Oneida, schools have been ordered closed by the Board of Health. Now, diphtheria was a disease that was very easily spread through bad sanitation. And this image from Harper's Weekly in 1881 says sowing for diphtheria, like spreading for diphtheria, and rural ventilation and sanitation. And we can see she's throwing out the slop, could be from the thunder mug, as they call it, or the chamber pot, and right there's the well. So this was a common problem in early farmsteads and things like that, not separating the privy far enough away from the water source. And in fact, there's a good chance that this is the disease that took its toll on the household, or the farm where I grew up. And up in Corinth, one of the old, the family that lived in that farmhouse back in the 1870s. Okay, specifics, 1879. And how many members of the family were lost from that? Yes, so 4 adult children died, and the 2 elder parents actually did survive this. But there is a good chance that this could have been what took them away. And if anyone's familiar with that good old computer game, Oregon Trail, this, back in the 80s and 90s, if you were playing this game, this was a dreaded screen. You would be informed that your game was over, that you had died of dysentery. And I will say it was an interesting way of learning about history. And it was, again, accurate in that regard, that you could be just going along in your wagon, heading out to the West Coast, and you could hit. So, again, in some way, the game trivializes it, but I will say my generation knows what dysentery is. And, oh, yes?
Just a quick look at Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
Sprue was celiac disease.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay. There were all sorts of treatments for dysentery, and this was also referred to as the Bloody Flux. It's also very common in military camps. Another issue of the latrines being located far too close to living arrangements, sources of water, etc. But this cure for dysentery that is in family collection of early receipts or recipes and cures. Cure for the dysentery, take rice, but cure for dysentery in family recipes and cure for dysentery. Take rice, brown it, pulverize it, and make it a coffee to drink. This will cure when nothing else will. At least it does focus on hydration. And a lot of these diseases that we talk about, dehydration was one of the things that would carry people off. And so, hey, it's getting some fluids in. But there were also a lot of patent medicines as well, with varying levels of effectiveness. Typhus, another disease you see a lot in the military, and spread by the body louse. And Typhus actually talks about here in the town of Galway, above Albany in this state, and it proved fatal to many persons. One case was marked with most malignant or malignant appearances. On the borders of a marsh, a horse had died and putrefied. A young woman who frequently passed that way was seized with violent pains in her head and sickness at the stomach. She was bled on the 2nd day, but the fever increased. She became delirious and died the 4th day, with her fingers and toes covered in blisters or spots, the edges of which were inflamed. From such facts, sir, I leave you to judge whether the worst forms of typhus fever may or may not have their origins in air climate. So one of the symptoms of typhus was blisters. So this was, again, from a very early newspaper in the 1790s. The Spectator in New York, but a shout out for Galway, but not what Galway wants to be shouted out for. I have Bonnie here. I refer to her and some of her friends that sometimes come to programs as the Galway contingent. So I've done a lot of programs over there for the Galway Preservation Society as well. I'll have to pull this one out sometime. Beware of horses, corpses in marshes. You hear about typhoid a lot, and sometimes there's confusion between typhus and typhoid. But what we most commonly hear about typhoid is connection to the term typhoid Mary. And we use this sometimes as a term today to someone who is spreading disease. Someone came into the office and with a bad cold, typhoid Mary, that kind of thing. But it's referring to an actual person, Mary Mallon, and who was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. And so the problem was she worked as a cook repeatedly in a number of different families that were mysteriously struck down with this disease. And the further problem with that was that she actually, even once they figured this out, she went back and worked as a cook. And so she was eventually imprisoned to prevent her from spreading her disease. And it was a very controversial case in and around New York City. And typhoid was also a danger, as were any other of these diseases, to medical professionals. And a young student nurse, Beatrice Young, from Hadley, Luzerne, she died from typhoid in 1926. And in fact, these is an interesting picture. It's her fellow student nurses acting as pallbearers at her residence, her family's residence up in Hadley, Luzerne area, and carrying her casket out. Cholera, another feared disease. And this image shows what could happen to a person within hours. And cholera is a severe gastrointestinal disease that, again, works primarily and kills through severe dehydration. Tetanus or lockjaw, another feared disease. And this is a story from Malta. And in fact, the major, who is the young man's name, son of David Wiggins, was cutting wood, a common everyday experience for people who lived in farmsteads, had wood stoves, things like that, even today. Was cutting wood when, upon striking a heavy blow, the axe glanced and struck him across the top of the foot, cutting through the bone completely, making a horrible wound from which the effects he was thrown into the lockjaw. Efforts were made to give the sufferer some nourishment by extracting his teeth, but human skill was unavailing, and on Wednesday night the rigid muscles were relaxed by death. And lockjaw or tetanus could be so severe that the individual would break their own bones and even their own back in the severe muscle spasms and tightening associated with this. This is his gravestone, as is seen in the Malta Ridge Cemetery, right over in Malta, near exit 13S. Rabies, another concern today, another concern of mad dogs, frequently back in the 18th and 19th centuries. You sometimes see a lot of diseases peculiar to children, and so you sometimes see teething as a cause of death. And this I chalk up to being a result of what's sometimes referred to as heroic medicine, in that really going above and beyond and kind of ignoring that part of first do no harm. Sometimes when children were teething, physicians or matrons would lance the gums to make it easier for the teeth to come through, leading to infection. Also, various treatments like with Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It sounds so nice, so wonderful. Was full of opium and alcohol, and overdoses were very common. And you see teething here. You also see suffocation and marasmus, severe failure to thrive, malnourishment of children. And again, people who were offering care could sometimes be endangered themselves, as was the case with Eliza Farnham. She was actually the topic of my master's thesis and a whole different subject, but she volunteered as a nurse during the Civil War, and it was consumption, tuberculosis, that she had contracted during the war that ended up killing her. Again, today, the media and disease, rumors spread quickly, so this one actually lists out causes of death here in Saratoga Springs.